My name is Tona Boyd, and I'm the Associate Director Counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to commemorate the 69th anniversary of the landmark Supreme Court case in Brown versus Board of Education, and to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the graduation of James Nabrit Jr. from this esteemed institution. Before we begin, I'd like to extend two very special thank yous to the president of Morehouse College, Dr. David Thomas, and to the founding dean of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel, Dr. Lawrence Edward Carter Sr., for hosting us here this evening. We are thrilled to hold LDF's inaugural event in Atlanta here at Morehouse. For those of you who don't know, LDF has its headquarters in New York City and an office in Washington, D.C., but we will soon be opening a physical location right here in Atlanta. So we are thrilled that we will have a home base for our work in the South, and we've already got 8 staff working hard here in Atlanta. The 1954 decision in Brown transformed the very fabric of our country and our democracy. For that reason, every year, LDF pauses to reflect on the courage of the young children and their families who stood as plaintiffs, on the bold and innovative strategies of those who served as attorneys, and on the transformational impact the case has had on our nation. Brown ended government-sanctioned apartheid in this country and was a watershed moment in the history of our democracy. Yet in many ways, the case was just the beginning of an ongoing climb to achieve true equality and equity in our nation. Now, despite the undeniable progress that LDF and others have made in the decades since this landmark case, as a country, we have yet to fulfill the promise of Brown. Now, that is painfully obvious from LDF's robust education litigation docket, which not only includes decades-old desegregation cases, but also cases defending new attacks on affirmative action, on race-conscious admissions, and on the truthful teaching of America's history in our schools, particularly as regards topics of race, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. We are no strangers to the evolution and shape-shifting tactics of racism and its intersections with sexism and heterosexism. Yet at LDF, we are steadfast in standing and continuing the fight that was started by our founder, the legendary Thurgood Marshall, and his fellow civil rights warrior, James Nabrit. We are fighting to create a new model of what it means to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and increasingly pluralist American democracy, where dignity is sacred, power is shared, and the opportunity to thrive is provided to everyone. Now I'd like to introduce to you the person who is leading LDF's efforts today. She will moderate our discussion tonight, and that is LDF's 8th President and Director Counsel, Janae Nelson.
Thank you so much for coming out. And thank you, Tona, for that wonderful introduction. I can't tell you how thrilled I am that we are here at Morehouse College to celebrate the 69th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. As Tona said, this is something that we do every year. It's a ritual for LDF. Brown v. Board was a seminal case that transformed our society. It's one of the cases of which we are most proud, although we have many we could choose from. Brown was seminal because it ended racial apartheid in this country. But as we know, segregation hasn't fully ended. So many of our schools are still racially segregated, not by choice, but because of so many vestiges of the history of slavery, Jim Crow, Black codes, and ongoing contemporary systemic racism. So our work around Brown is not over, which is why every year we come together to have a discussion about how we can fulfill the full promise of Brown. The full promise of Brown doesn't mean simply putting people of different races together in a classroom. It means ensuring that children, and especially Black children in this country, have access to excellent education like you do here at Morehouse College. So that is our mission. That's something that we are continuing to work towards in everything that we do. And we are just delighted and honored to be hosted here at Morehouse College to have this important discussion. So let's get to the conversation, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So I hope that you all are thinking about some of the ways you want to engage us in conversation. But let me start by bringing out our very first guest, who you know well, and that is your president of Morehouse College. He is the 12th president, and I think it was just in 2018 that he was installed, just 5 years ago. So please come on out. This is your president, David Thomas, and I'm so thankful, one, that you've had us here today, but also for the work that you do to write on issues of race and diversity, the amazing program that he created here at Morehouse, where there's a reduced tuition online program, so Black men who were not able to complete their studies here on campus are able to nonetheless get a degree. That's the type of innovation that your president is bringing to higher education. And I think I read somewhere that just last year you were named one of the 100 most influential people in Atlanta by Georgia Trend. So give it up for your president. Thank you so much for having us. I'm also delighted to introduce Anjanae Davis, who is the co-founder of the Low Country Black Parents Association. He is, yes, a wonderful education activist and an advocate for equity. He has been doing a lot of work with the Legal Defense Fund on our Pro-Truth initiative, where we are trying to combat the many laws that are proliferating across the country to erase the lived experiences of Black people and other marginalized groups by eliminating many of the stories and much of the truth that is at the foundation of this democracy. So we are grateful for the work that Anjanae does, and he's coming from South Carolina. That's where that low country is, although you have some low country here in Georgia. He's representing South Carolina, and we're so grateful to have him with us tonight. And then last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce my colleague at the Legal Defense Fund, Jinhee Lee. Jinhee Lee is the Director of Strategic Initiatives. Jinhee has been at LDF for 14 years. She is a top litigator, one of the foremost civil rights litigators in this country. And just last year, she became the inaugural director of our Strategic Initiatives Department. So she is the person who is leading the fight on so much of the integrated advocacy that we do around justice and public safety, around pro-truth, in the affirmative action cases that we're working on, and so many other areas. So Jen is here tonight to lend her expertise to us, and we're ready to get started. We talked about the commemoration of the centennial of James Nabrit's graduation from Morehouse College. He is a name that you should know, and especially those of you who are Morehouse students should be very proud of this individual that your institution produced. He is a son of Atlanta, a son of Morehouse College, and a luminary at the Legal Defense Fund who really helped to influence the Brown versus Board of Education litigation by not only litigating one of the cases that were consolidated to be the Brown case ultimately, but also the strategy. He had a really strong idea about what the strategy should be, and we're going to get into a little bit of that as we talk today. But I just wanted to start with that grounding. It's been 100 years since James Nabrit, who's obviously since passed, graduated from Morehouse College. How did Morehouse shape him? How did what he learned here and the faculty that he interacted with and his fellow students shape the vision that led ultimately to the Brown versus Board of Education decision?
Okay. Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be invited here to join this panel and to talk about James Nabrit, whose legacy I encountered only since I've been here at Morehouse. And so, you know, for a moment, right, if we just allow our imaginations to think about the fact that James Nabrit, a black man from the South, born in 1900, gets admitted to Morehouse College and graduates in 1923 with a host of individuals who go on to be very prominent, one of whom is Howard Thurman, one of the major theologians of the 20th century. And you think about what's happening to those young men, some of whom either their grandparents or their parents were slaves, and they come to Morehouse. And here at Morehouse, they are introduced to an idea that actually defies the racial gravity of the nation, right? Which is that black men can lead and serve and change the world. And that they are in a country that is a contradiction. And that contradiction is, on one hand, it's based on this notion of all men are created equal. On the other hand, it is founded on the notion or on the idea of slavery and the application of slavery and the inferiority of black people. And what he learns here is this notion that we should challenge this country to live up to its founding ideals. He goes on to Howard University, and he becomes part of this project. And there's some history about Howard University's law school, where the president there gets this idea that he should found a law school that's going to be focused on breaking down the legal barriers to black people's full enfranchisement in our society. And there's a debate. There's Charles Hamilton Houston, there's Thurgood Marshall, there's James Nabrit. Hamilton and Houston are focused on the argument of treating everybody equal, and Nabrit is actually focused on the argument of, you know, what does it mean to really live up to our democracy? And I'll just give you a quote that I found in my research. That's him talking to a conference of lawyers as they're creating the strategy. He says, the attack, meaning the attack on segregation for the Brown versus Board of Education test cases, and there were a number of them, but they all wound up being under Brown. The attack should be waged with the most devastating forces at hand. Let the Supreme Court take the blame if it dares to say to the entire world, yes, democracy rests on a legalized caste system. Segregation of the races is legal. Let the court write this across the face of the Constitution. All men are equal, but white men are more equal than others. The seeds for that resistance, right? That calling America, you know, to account were sown here at Morehouse. And then we hear the echo of it in 1963 when Martin Luther King stands and says, we've come to collect. Right? We've come to collect. And to me, that's the forging that happens here at Morehouse. I think he's a great representation of early Morehouse and the soul of what Morehouse continues to do.
Well, thank you for that historical grounding. And James Nabrit really does exemplify, I think, the strength that we understand resides at Morehouse, and that is forged and cultivated here. And you're right to point out that he was much more radical in his vision of what should happen in Brown versus Board. And I want to just crystallize that for a moment. What he wanted to do was to directly attack the institution of segregation, not say that there should be equal facilities here and there. He said no, because the segregation itself attacked the dignity of Black people. And to say that we can still be separate but have equal facilities left that dignitary harm intact. And he was fully against that and pushed Thurgood Marshall and others to embrace a much more radical and broad theory when they challenged Brown in the Supreme Court. And so, Jen, I want to go to you because you are currently litigating cases that are holdovers in many ways from Brown versus Board. Many people don't know that the Legal Defense Fund has the largest docket of desegregation cases outside of the Department of Justice. We have about 100 cases that remain from the time that Brown versus Board was litigated. So, Jen, you've litigated deseg cases. You're in the affirmative action cases as well. How does Brown provide a platform for the litigation that we do today? And how does Nabrit's forcing a reckoning with segregation as opposed to equal facilities or equal access, how does that live out in the work that you're doing in litigation?
Well, I'd like to start by saying I just love that quote by James Nabrit, because I think that really, in a very eloquent way, distills what is so powerful about the Brown decision. My favorite line from the Brown decision is that public education is the foundation of good citizenship, recognizing that it's education where we teach our children civic values, what we want our country to be, what it can be, and how can we purport to be a democracy when we have state-imposed caste system, state-imposed apartheid that relegates Black people as second-class citizens all across the country. It was a recognition that for the integrity and the soul of our country, that segregation had to be banned. And what that decision said was, I think in simple terms, people often think that Brown meant to ban legal segregation. But it meant much more than that. And I think that's what we're trying to do at the Legal Defense Fund right now, because certainly the remnants of the vestiges of that de jure segregation lives on. And we do not live in a day, unfortunately, where we have racial equality, where people have equal opportunities in education. And of course, education is the great equalizer. It's the source of pathways to careers, to leadership opportunities, to a future that everyone dreams of. And that, I think, is the core of our education work today. We have in our school desegregation cases where there continues to be actual vestiges of de jure segregation that continues in some school districts. But then we have these affirmative action cases where, how can we live in a society where our most selective colleges and universities exclude, great swaths of talented and qualified students with tremendous potential? That's a loss not only to the universities, it's a loss to our country. And that's the kind of work that we're doing right now. And then with our pro-truth work, our pro-truth initiative, what we should be doing is fixing the broken and dysfunctional public educational system that we have across the country. But unfortunately, what we're having to do now is to fight back against these attacks on truth in public education curriculum. this proliferation of state and local efforts to ban what they call critical race theory. But what it truly is any even recognition that racism and systemic racism continues to exist in this country. So this is the core of the work that we do. And Brown was a crowning achievement for LDF, and we have a huge responsibility to continue with that legacy.
Well, Jen, thank you for all the work that you do to advance that legacy, along with a whole team of lawyers and organizers and researchers and policy councils at the Legal Defense Fund. And we do that work in partnership with community partners like Anjane, which is critical because we want to make sure that when we invest the time to litigate or advocate for new policies, that the people directly affected in those jurisdictions are also partners with us in that work and can continue to hold elected officials and other decision makers to account. And that's what is happening with the Low Country Black Parents Association. So we've been quoting Nabrit, and there's actually a quote that I want to read to you, Anjane, that I think is really powerful about education and what education means. And Jen, you talked a little bit about that when you said that your favorite line in Brown is about the link between education and citizenship. So this is something else that James Nabrit said. He said, education must meet the needs of the human spirit. In a democracy, it must provide the wisdom for minority and majority races to live together on a plane of equality. It must assist in the cultivation of individual and group values consonant with the democratic ideal. So he, before Brown, was already saying these things. He drew the link between citizenship and democracy and was able to get the court to draw that link between education and citizenship and democracy. So I'm curious about the work that you do to create not just greater access, but to give Black children excellence in education. How does this quote resonate with you, and do you see a connection to the work that you're doing?
Definitely. I want to say before I start, a kudos to LDF for being such a strong community partner. Being a grassroots organization in South Carolina, a very red conservative state, coming from the city of Charleston, where 40% of the African American population is attributed to have come through that port. A city that prides itself on its history, but a very whitewashed history. It was not easy to come to the conclusion of creating an organization specific for Black families in a space where we got started right at the beginning of a pandemic, but we were still reeling from the tragedy of what happened at Mother Emanuel and Walter Scott, a state that only took down the Confederate flag after the tragedy of Mother Emanuel. So I want to kind of give folks the context of what I'm going to say. I work at a high school, Burke High School, which is 120 years old, historically Black. The land for that high school was endowed by a pastor by the name of Reverend John L. Dart, 100 acres on Peninsula Charleston, specific to the education of African American children in 1897. So education is my passion, it is my heart. I'm not originally from Charleston, I'm from a rural part of the state called Allendale. It's usually pretty much outhouses and dirt roads. But it was there that I was grounded in the belief of that quote of how important education is. And in founding my organization, what I found is that in the 21st century, now more than ever, education is an asset that we can no longer take for granted. As I sit and I look in this audience and I see all the young people, I really want you to understand that while you travel the halls of this institution and you go out into the world, your education does not stop. It's ongoing. Unfortunately, though, there are powers that be that want to make the foundation of your education irrelevant. They want to not just take away the historical accuracy of what's being taught in K-12 education or in colleges. They want to erase the cultural imprint that Black people have contributed to this society. I live in a state that, with the help of LDF, we fought back 5 anti-CRT bills last legislative session. 5. I think you need to give them a round of applause for that. States like Florida get a lot of attention. Texas gets a lot of attention, but I can guarantee you this. Go look at every southern state, look at their legislative agenda, and you will see the same bills. The only difference is Florida and Texas gets a lot more media publicity because of their political leanings. But the entire South right now is under attack. And my organization was brought about to help the most vulnerable Black families. South Carolina's a largely rural state. So we didn't have like any organizations in state that were trying to help us navigate through the pandemic and then when the assault on education happened. So thankfully, I was blessed to have come into contact with LDF, who provided us with resources we couldn't have possibly imagined. We had people going to our state house that had never set foot in the legislative chamber before. But these people were also able to craft testimony and then come back to their communities with a sense of pride and accomplishment that they spoke up not just for their children, but for future generations that will be impacted by the decisions that we're having now.
Thank you so much for that grounding. And thank you for acknowledging the work. Like I said, it's only because of the partnerships that we are as successful as we are, and we're proud that we were able to beat back those 5 bills. But best believe they're back, they're more, and that was just one legislative session. And in each legislative session across the South, we're seeing similar legislation being proposed. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we honor the need and the essentiality of HBCUs as we also talk about affirmative action, right? Because many people can easily walk away with the assumption that in fighting for access through affirmative action, that is in somehow denigrating the value of HBCUs and suggesting that, no, we really want to make sure there's access to PWIs. I think what is critical, and which links the work that we're doing today to Brown, is that it's about access and choice and not being told where and how you can be educated. So HBCUs are just as critical to the ecosystem of education as any other institution in this country. And so, Jen, I wanted to bring you in to talk about the affirmative action cases. So all of you know that there are 2 cases before the Supreme Court pending. One is a challenge to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the other is Harvard. And Jen has been instrumental in leading our litigation efforts in both of those cases, where we were interveners in one and amici in another. But maybe you can explain the connection between today's affirmative action cases and Brown, and especially how important it is to have a variety of options in higher learning.
Well, I think perhaps the best way to talk about this is to just directly address the plaintiff's arguments in the affirmative action cases, because they make the argument that affirmative action in the cases by the Supreme Court that had reaffirmed affirmative action for over 4 decades, that they compared that to Plessy, and saying that Brown demanded an end to affirmative action. So you can imagine how shocking that is to read that on a piece of paper. And so comparing the cases that have reaffirmed affirmative action to Plessy really shows how little they understand what Brown is about. And we felt compelled to explain that to the court in our own brief. So LDF and the NAACP National Office together submitted an amicus brief in the UNC case. As the lawyers and as the organizations that litigated Brown and litigated the school desegregation cases, knowing what we were trying to achieve, knowing what the court had decided, that the Brown decision was not about race blindness. It was not about saying that just because the law says people are equal means that people are truly equal. That what we need, in fact, is race consciousness. How can one dismantle racism and systemic inequalities if we don't even acknowledge and understand, or to try to understand how racism manifests itself and continues to manifest itself. So that's one of the challenges right now, because it's really easy for people to jump on the bandwagon saying that colorblindness is the true equality, when we in fact know that's not the case. That in fact colorblindness or race blindness cements pre-existing inequalities and maintains status quo that none of us are satisfied with. And so if we truly want to advance towards a world, a society that we all want and that we all believe can exist, then we have to acknowledge that racism exists, and we have to acknowledge people's races, and we have to acknowledge that people have differing opportunities. And because of those differing opportunities, it's really incumbent upon colleges, universities like Harvard and UNC to do all they can to ensure that they have a diverse student body, and to ensure that the opportunities are shared for everyone, regardless of their race.
Thank you, Jen. So, I mean, you're 100% right. You cannot fight, you cannot eradicate, you cannot dismantle that which you will not acknowledge. And we are finding that there is a proliferation of bills across the country that Anjane already talked about, that aim to really erase that history from curricula. So we're not only fighting the battle of segregation. We know that about 1/3 of the student population in our public schools, K through 12, are in schools that are predominantly of a single race. We know that segregation, that level of segregation persists. That's about 18.5 million students who are in these hyper-segregated schools. But we don't even know how we got there if we can't teach the truth of that history. So since 2021, there have been 200 bills in 44 states introduced to change our curriculum, to sanitize it, and to deny the history of race and racism in this country, as well as gender and other categories of information that may be divisive or may make people feel guilty or have certain feelings. I mean, that's literally written into the legislation. And most recently in Louisiana, there was a bill introduced that bans discussions about the history of racism because it's inglorious, because it's an inglorious history that they don't want taught to the children of Louisiana. So I want to ask you, Anjane, how do we fight this battle for truth in a country, and particularly in a state like yours that has such a rich history? I mean, I have Geechee Gullah roots. I can't imagine that we would not be able to lift that up and celebrate it. So I want to understand how you center truth as part of the fight for education, equity, and access in this country.
So for me, the first thing is to acknowledge that Black is beautiful. And that's a message that has been lost. As a society, we've watched the deterioration of what Blackness has meant through the generations. And there's been this narrative that has been crafted that the Black existence in this society is solely about us being enslaved and then being freed and then civil rights, but never about the power of our resilience, the power of the things that we contributed that not only benefited our community, but society as a whole. So if you don't understand the Black contribution, if you don't understand the numerous Black towns and cities that existed that were wiped off the map and how that came to be. People talk about Tulsa, but we have hundreds of Tulsas. If you don't understand that, then you'll never understand how to build your community in an organic way to fight back against the very real systemic and institutional racism that we are faced with today. So,
Thank you so much for that. So we're going to open this up to questions, and there's a microphone here.
Good evening. My name is Robert L. Pinkney. I'm a junior finance major with a minor in computer science and technology. and I also serve on the Morehouse NAACP board. And my question is, as a young person in college, as I've grown up, because I'm from Chicago also, I know the stories of Emmett Till and Rodney King. And I saw Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and Laquan McDonald. As someone who is now entering his adulthood, what is our responsibility to ensure that we're doing our part to ensure that these travesties don't become a common occurrence that we just accept? Because, as I become older, I realize that soon, within the next 10 to 15 years, I probably will have children. And I want to ensure that I'm doing my part and we're doing our part as the NAACP now to put and implement things in place that we are proud of, to call a world that we live in for our children. Because, although we've made excellent strides, there's still a lot to be done, quite frankly. And I want to ask all of you, what do you think our part is? Because I know that we march and we do all those things. However, I believe in a multi-pronged approach. It doesn't just stop there. There's also the legal aspect, changing legislation, making sure things are going through the House and the Senate. But what is our job to ensure that this movement is being pushed forward in the most positive direction that it can?
So first, let me say you're already doing something by being here. And thank you for your service so far. I will have to say I'm sad that in 2023, as a young Black person, you even have to say that. That you rattled off names of individuals who are no longer with us so easily. That's where we are. So I think first and foremost, understand your voice. A wise person told me, don't try to eat the elephant in one bite, take it one bite at a time. Understand your surroundings, understand your environment, understand how things work in those spaces. Understand the people in your networks. This work is soul crushing. We love to mythologize the people who have been a part of the movement without recognizing the true sacrifices. My encouragement to you, young man, is do not let this work take your soul, because it will. Don't think that you have to save the world from itself. And I have to take the onus and the responsibility that I have to continue making sure that I do what I can to lift that burden off of you. And so I would first just say, keep doing what you're doing, keep learning, keep experiencing life and learning along the way. We all didn't have all the answers. We still don't. But I don't want you to take on this idea that you have to put on a cape. Okay? You don't.
Yeah, listen, I co-sign everything that Brother Anjane said. What I will say, I love the fact that you are sort of projecting to your future self as an adult, and I encourage you not to become desensitized. We often talk about the young people being the radicals. The folks on this stage are the people who never left that space, who carried that into adulthood and who have turned their lives over to it. And I encourage you, whatever you decide to do with yourself, hold on to a piece of that. Because if we think about the civil rights movement, it was actually just a fraction of Black people in this country who actually drove that civil rights movement. But imagine if every Black person in particular, and every person who cared about social justice, did something, even if they weren't doing the work full time, if they each did something, we would be transforming this country. And I do believe we are in a moment of opportunity. It feels very unstable. It feels very chaotic. It feels very threatening. Those are all the ingredients for transformation. Those are all the moments that real opportunity exists for real radical change to happen. And so you're asking the right questions in this moment. And I'm saying, hold on to that fire. Don't let it destroy you. Don't let it crush your soul, but hold on to that fire and that desire to create a better future for your children and for everyone's children, for the future generations of this country.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Trey Najmongo. I am a senior political science major, criminal justice and sociology, double minor at Morehouse College. And first, I just wanted to thank you all for coming to speak with us this evening. You all spoke extensively about pro-truth, affirmative action, and other educational attacks that are going on in this country. But as the landscape of the Supreme Court has dramatically shifted throughout the last few years, I think the fear is that all of our institutions are soon to be under attack. So with that being said, what can the young leaders in this room do to follow in the footsteps of James Nabrit and potentially develop a new strategy to combat what seems to be a hypertextualist approach that the Supreme Court is adopting right now?
So that's a great question, and it's good to see you again. I'll say this, and this requires a much longer conversation. What we're finding in a number of ways is that as the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary has now been stacked with a lot of conservative justices, one, we are doing a lot of work to try to rebalance the courts. So that's number one. And Tona Boyd, who you heard from earlier today, is coming from the White House prior to becoming the Associate Director Counsel, and helped to work to bring the first Black woman Supreme Court justice on board. So listen, progress is happening. We also see, if you're paying attention to recent reports around the Supreme Court, some things are happening, and we don't know where that's going to take us. What's important, though, about addressing systemic racism is that not only do we rely on civil rights statutes, not only do we rely on the very direct ways to address race discrimination, but we're also now having to look outside of just those traditional pathways and using some of the rhetoric, some of the precedent from the court in non-traditional ways to try to achieve ultimately racial justice and address disparities in ways that may not even be the direct, this is race discrimination on its face. And so we need the partnership of young people like you to really think about how these things are happening in ways that are going to be new and different given the nature of race and racism as a shape-shifting, which is something we said in the earlier remarks, organism, that it's always going to be something different and show up in different forms. And especially with the effort to try to turn this into a sort of colorblind or a race-neutral issue, we have to look at other statutes and other ways, even if you look at the way the court gives such tremendous deference to religious freedom. We've been thinking about ways to use those strategies to try to use the court's own precedent and against itself, if you understand what I'm saying, in ways that can advance racial justice.
Thank you.
Welcome. I'm going to ask that we do 2 questions at a time and try to answer them.
My name is Bryce Bennett. I am a dual degree engineering major. I go to Morehouse College. And my question is, how can we as a younger generation revolutionize and update the way educational system teach and educate scholars about issues that the media and news cover up?
My name is Sexton Chapman. I'm a physics major, sophomore at Morehouse College. And my question is, particularly in leadership, how do you communicate? Like you guys talked about how James Nabrit had a different way to attack the idea of segregation or just that litigation. How do you communicate amongst yourselves, essentially your own point of view, while at the same time like moving forward with the community and standing on what you believe, while wanting to keep things consolidated?
So since I'm in education, the first point is being involved at the policy level, the local school boards. A lot of people don't realize that when it comes down to things like curriculum, the textbooks, which have been the target of a lot of these bans, most states provide an opportunity for the public to weigh in on the textbooks and the curriculum that they use. Also, at the state level, you have an opportunity to provide your feedback and information to your local state board of education, however you have it. I would encourage you to make sure that you use that. And as Dr. Thomas said, your votes are also a very powerful tool, people would be surprised at how little turnout you get in local school boards. That's one of the biggest challenges. How many people have heard of the group Moms for Liberty in this room? If you haven't, go Google it when you leave here tonight. They are arguably the biggest enemy of public education right now. If you want to know why a lot of these attacks are happening, it's because of groups like that, because they're doing what you're talking about. They're influencing the curriculum bands and the types of discussions that you can have in public education. And unfortunately, the media has given them a pass in doing so.
And I'll answer the question about how leadership speaks to one another. You know, we are trying to be much more coordinated. There are a number of groups out there that are doing important civil rights work and racial justice work in particular. And what I know to be true is that we recognize, as I was saying earlier, how essential this moment is to seize, not just because it has the potential to be transformative, which is the way I like to look at it, but it also has the potential to take us backwards and to cause us to lose the potential of an entire generation, if not several. And so it's very important that civil rights leaders and movement leaders and grassroots leaders are in conversation. We often follow the desires and demands of the communities that we represent. We believe that the people who are closest to the problem often have the solutions, and even if they can't articulate them fully or know exactly what the remedy is, they know the problem and they can talk to you about that in a way that, you know, if you're far removed from it, you just can't see it as clearly. That said, the communities we work with also come to organizations like ours because they want a partner in the thinking about it, right? They want to know what we know and what historical perspective we can bring to it and what we're seeing in other cities and towns across the country. So it's having that respectful dialogue and recognizing that everybody brings something valuable to the table in an effort to try to solve this very complicated problem of race.
My question is on a realistic aspect. Knowing how the middle class and lower class citizens operate, how can we have citizens stop avoiding the issue at hand, like pushing private schools or colleges or schools of higher class, and attack the issue at hand, which is public schools and just funding for that?
Okay. Kyrie Davis, senior philosophy major from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I have a second question. My first one was a bit too dense, but I think it goes well with my brothers. Around the narrative of, you know, legal and political strife being racial, now more than ever, we have more identities in the political spectrum. So if you could speak about how, not just historically, but presently, the struggle that the Black community is going through is not just a struggle for everyone, but a success in our realm is a success for all peoples. Brown versus Board wasn't just a success for Black and white children, but as we see post, a boost for all children that could come to this nation and succeed at the public realm. So if you could speak on those two things, thank you.
There's no question that when we do better, when we bring this country to comply with its own promises and to live out its constitutional ideals, everyone benefits. We do that work because we are the ones who are primarily victimized, but we do that work in service of this country, you know, even if that's just a byproduct of our own survival. So that's something that, you know, I feel very strongly about. And very proud of the legacy that Black people have in this country, that so much of what we've done has, you know, you talked about lifting all boats. We've lifted a lot of boats. We've lifted a lot of boats, and to save ourselves from drowning, right? We've done a lot of work. And what I think is important for this next phase of justice making is to recognize that and to have everyone recognize the value of Black progress, but also to make this a multi-racial, multi-ethnic effort. we should not be shouldering this burden alone because of the benefits that it yields to so many other people. And I think there is an appetite for some of that cross-racial coalition work and really intersectional work as well. I mean, you talked about a lot of different identities, and there are many identities within the Black community that we can leverage that touches on so many different aspects of our identity and who we are, and allows us to get at some of the root causes of oppression more broadly, you know, even beyond race, that I think are incredibly important. And I think your generation in particular sees that, and it's important to you to have your full identity recognized in this struggle.
And to answer your question about the middle and lower classes as it relates to education and conversation, what I'm going to say is something that, especially here at Morehouse, institution renowned for its producing brilliant young Black male minds. The class conversation that needs to be had or is being had also must, not needs to, must include Black women. I think there is this notion, and we don't speak, this is one of the housekeeping issues that happens in our community. There can be no class struggle, no class advancement for Black people in America that does not have Black women at the forefront. And as a Black man, I'm telling you, by doing this work, being a practitioner, you can understand and navigate the class struggle more efficiently and effectively by listening and paying attention to the moves of Black women. It was the Black woman who managed the households during our enslavement and beyond to help keep the Black family together. They understood the economics that was necessary to raise our families and keep us afloat. And so as we look at education, when you go and you look at the demographic statistics, you'll find that more often than not, many of our students in our public schools are in households where they're single parents, right? But what we have to do as a community is get back to, as the elder said, we're all each other's responsibility. And so we have to destigmatize these labels of a single parent, because classism, as much as racism, is a tool, a weapon used to prevent Black students from getting the quality education that they deserve. So in essence, listen to Black women.
On behalf of all of our panelists here, I want to say thank you for being with us tonight and sharing your questions and your ideas. And I want to thank our panelists. They were just absolutely tremendous, so please join me in thanking them as well.